In the winter of 1315, Europe did not lose a war. It lost the ground beneath its feet. There were no invading armies, no burning cities, no final battles to remember. Instead, rain fell without mercy. Crops drowned before they could grow. Seasons stopped obeying the rules people had trusted for generations. And slowly, without noise or announcement, the idea of normal life began to collapse. Imagine waking up each morning to do everything right, planting, praying, waiting only to watch the earth refuse your effort again and again. Imagine realizing that strength no longer helps, faith no longer promises relief, and staying loyal to your land may kill your children. This is the moment history rarely shows you. The moment when survival stops being about courage and starts being about choice. The moment when entire villages understand that holding on is more dangerous than letting go. This is not a story about famine alone. It is a story about the exact point where civilization breaks its own rules in order to live. Because in 1315, people did not just starve. They adapted, abandoned, disappeared, and in doing so, they revealed the most uncomfortable truth of all. Sometimes, survival requires you to become invisible. When nature silently cancels civilization, the catastrophe of 1315 did not arrive with a scream. It arrived with rain, not a storm that passed, not a season that misbehaved, but rain that refused to leave. Week after week, the sky stayed heavy. Fields turned into shallow lakes, roads dissolved into mud, seed grain rotted before it could even sprout. Animals weakened because pasture never dried. Sunlight essential, expected, relied upon simply vanished from the rhythm of life. This is what makes 1315 so terrifying. Nothing happened. No invasion, no plague at first. No great event people could point to and say, this is the moment everything broke. Nature just stopped cooperating. Medieval society was built on one fragile assumption, that the seasons would behave the way they always had. Plant in spring, grow through summer, harvest before winter, store, survive. That rhythm was not just agriculture, it was civilization itself. Law, religion, taxation, social order, even morality were all timed to that cycle. When the rhythm collapsed, everything built on top of it collapsed too. And here is the uncomfortable truth most histories soften. Civilizations are not destroyed first. They are abandoned by the systems that sustain them. The people of 1315 did not understand climate patterns. They had no concept of long-term weather shifts. To them, the world simply stopped making sense. The rules they had lived by their entire lives no longer worked. You could be hardworking and still starve. You could be obedient and still lose everything. You could pray, plan, and prepare and watch it rot anyway. This kind of collapse is uniquely cruel because it offers no enemy to fight. You cannot negotiate with rain. You cannot punish a failed season. You cannot rebuild when the ground itself refuses to hold your effort. The lesson here is not historical, it is structural. Civilizations fall, not when people become evil, but when the environment they depend on quietly withdraws permission to continue. And that is why the winter of 1315 matters. It teaches us that stability is not guaranteed by tradition, strength, or faith alone. It is guaranteed only as long as the underlying system's climate, land, resources continue to cooperate. When those systems change, collapse does not look dramatic. It looks slow, confusing, silent. It looks like people waking up every day, doing the same things, and realizing too late that effort no longer produces results. That is how civilizations truly end. Not with fire, but with fields that no longer answer human hands. Hunger reveals the true shape of society. Hunger does not simply empty the stomach. It strips away illusion. When food disappeared after 1315, society did not collapse all at once. It thinned, slowly, layer by layer. What remained was not what people believed they were, but what scarcity forced them to become. At first, people tried to behave normally. Laws were still spoken. Customs were still observed. Neighbors still greeted one another. But hunger is patient, and it waits until politeness becomes too expensive to maintain. As grain stores emptied, something fundamental shifted. Theft was no longer an act of rebellion. It became an act of survival. A loaf of bread was no longer property. It was life itself. And when survival is on the line, moral lines blur without asking permission. Authorities struggled to enforce order not because they lost power, but because they lost food. A law means nothing when the man enforcing it is starving. Courts slowed. Punishments became inconsistent. Justice itself began to bend, not out of mercy, but weakness. Charity collapsed in the most tragic way possible. Not because hearts hardened, but because hands were empty. People wanted to help. They simply had nothing left to give. The moral fabric of society didn't tear from cruelty, it unraveled from exhaustion. What 1,315 exposed is something deeply uncomfortable. Ethics require surplus. Kindness, generosity, patience, and restraint all depend on having enough. When enough disappears, even good people are pushed into impossible choices. Hunger does not create monsters. It reveals how thin the line is between order and desperation. Families turned inward, villages fractured, loyalty shrank to the smallest unit that could still survive. Not because people became evil, but because hunger forces priority. You feed your child before your neighbor. You protect your own before you protect the law. And here lies the real lesson. Civilization is not held together by ideals. It is held together by access. Access to food, access to stability, access to the belief that tomorrow will be survivable. Remove that access, and society does not explode, it contracts. It becomes narrow, it becomes quiet, it becomes brutal in ways that feel shameful only in hindsight. The famine of 1,315 shows us that the true shape of society is not revealed in comfort, prosperity, or peace. It is revealed when there is not enough to go around, and every choice costs something sacred. Hunger does not ask who you want to be. It asks what you are willing to sacrifice to stay alive, and history answers that question without mercy. Abandonment was not failure, it was intelligence. When we imagine survival, we imagine endurance. We imagine people holding on, rebuilding, resisting, refusing to let go. But the winter of 1,315 tells a different, far more unsettling truth. Sometimes the smartest choice is to leave. Entire medieval villages did exactly that, not in panic, not in chaos, but in grim, calculated silence. Homes were left standing, tools lay where they were last used. Wells were abandoned, even though they had taken years to dig. Churches, the spiritual center of village life, stood empty. To modern eyes, this looks like defeat. To those living it, it was intelligence. Staying meant consuming the last scraps of land that could no longer feed them. Staying meant watching children weaken one by one. Staying meant loyalty to soil that had already betrayed them. Leaving was not emotional. It was mathematical. People followed rumors because rumor was better than certainty of death. Rumors of drier land, rumors of monasteries with stored grain, rumors of forests where forage still existed. They did not know if those rumors were true. But they knew one thing with absolute clarity. The land they stood on could no longer support life. Abandonment required something far harder than strength. It required detachment. Detachment from identity. Detachment from ancestry. Detachment from the idea that where you were born is where you must die. This was not cowardice. It was adaptation. Medieval life was deeply rooted. Land defined who you were. Leaving meant losing status, memory, and often protection. It meant becoming a stranger, a burden, sometimes a servant, sometimes a beggar. But even that was preferable to starvation. And here lies the deeper lesson that history rarely states plainly. Persistence is only virtue when the system still works. When the system is broken, persistence becomes self-destruction. Intelligence recognizes when effort no longer produces results. Wisdom knows when loyalty becomes lethal. Those villages that vanished were not erased by failure. They were erased by choice. By people who understood, often painfully, that survival sometimes requires sacrificing permanence. The land did not mourn them. History barely recorded them. But their decisions saved lives. Abandonment in 1315 was not running away. It was moving toward the only remaining option: life itself. And that truth still unsettles us today because it forces us to ask whether we know the difference between resilience and refusal to let go. Strength failed, flexibility survived. In times of crisis, people like to believe that the strong endure and the weak disappear. The winter of 1315 exposed how false that belief really is. Physical strength did not guarantee survival. Endurance did not ensure safety. Even preparation, when built on old assumptions, failed without warning. The famine did not reward power, it punished rigidity. Those who survived were rarely the biggest, the toughest, or the most dominant. They were the most adaptable. Families that traveled light lived longer than those who tried to protect everything they owned. People who accepted unfamiliar roles endured longer than those who clung to status. Communities that merged survived, where proud, isolated villages vanished. Flexibility became a form of intelligence. Men who once owned land accepted labor under other lords. Women who managed households adapted to foraging, trade, and movement. Social hierarchies softened because hunger does not respect rank. Survival demanded cooperation, not dominance. Pride became lethal. The refusal to change, to bend, to submit temporarily to new realities killed faster than the cold. Strength, when tied to old identity, became an anchor pulling people under. The famine revealed something brutal but clear. Resilience is not resistance. True resilience is adjustment. It is knowing when to release one way of life so another can begin. Flexibility allowed people to cross boundaries, geographical, social, psychological, that strength alone could not. It allowed strangers to become allies and former equals to accept unequal roles without shame. It allowed life to continue, even when dignity had to be redefined. This lesson cuts against the stories we tell ourselves. We celebrate endurance. We praise those who never give up. But history shows that survival often belongs to those who know when to stop pushing against reality and start moving with it. In 1315, the rigid broke, the flexible endured. And that truth is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront a hard question. Are we strong or are we adaptable? Because when the world changes, only one of those keeps you alive. The greatest tragedies happen in silence. History remembers what makes noise. Battles, revolutions, crowns falling, cities burning. These events announce themselves loudly enough to be written down, sung about, carved into stone. The famine of 1315 did none of that, and that is precisely why it is so dangerous to forget. The greatest tragedy of that winter was not only the number of lives lost, but the way those lives disappeared without spectacle. There were no final stands, no decisive moments, no clear beginning or end. People did not fall all at once. They faded. Villages did not explode into chaos. They thinned. One family gone, then another. Fields left untended. Houses closed but still standing. A church bell that rang less often, until it stopped entirely. Silence crept in long before death was acknowledged. This is how mass suffering often looks from the inside. Ordinary days becoming harder to survive. Routines slowly collapsing. Hope shrinking without anyone being able to name the moment it vanished. There was no single day when people said, "This is the catastrophe." By the time it was obvious, it was already too late. The famine left fewer records than wars because starving people do not write history. They conserve energy, they endure quietly. Many could not leave testimony because they left nothing behind, not even graves. And here is the lesson history whispers but rarely shouts. Silence is not peace. Silence is often collapse in progress. The absence of rebellion did not mean acceptance. The lack of riots did not mean stability. It meant exhaustion. It meant people were too weak to resist, too uncertain to organize, too focused on surviving one more day to imagine change. The world did not notice villages disappearing because disappearance does not draw attention. A house left empty does not cry out. A field left unplanted does not demand explanation. Absence is easy to overlook until it becomes permanent. This is why the famine of 1315 feels so haunting. It teaches us that the most destructive crises do not always arrive with drama. They arrive quietly, disguised as inconvenience, delay, bad seasons, or temporary hardship. And by the time silence becomes visible, the damage has already settled in. The lesson is not just historical, it is human. Pay attention not only to what is loud, but to what is vanishing, because history's deepest wounds are often the ones that never scream. Community was redefined by necessity. Before the famine, community meant permanence. It meant birthplace, shared land, familiar names, and generations tied to the same soil. You belonged because you were born there, because your parents were known, because your place in the social order was already decided. The winter of 1315 shattered that idea completely. As food disappeared, the old definition of community became impossible to maintain. Entire villages fractured, not out of betrayal, but out of necessity. People could no longer survive as large, fixed groups bound by tradition alone. Mobility replaced permanence. Usefulness replaced lineage. Families began to move in fragments. Small groups traveled along rivers, forest edges, and trade paths, following whatever resources might still exist. Monasteries, estates with stored grain, and remote woodland areas became magnets not because of faith or loyalty, but because they offered one thing that mattered more than anything else: food. In this new reality, community stopped asking where you came from. It asked what you could contribute. Could you forage? Could you hunt? Could you repair tools? Could you carry loads? Could you work land that was not yours? Survival redefined belonging overnight. Those who could not contribute were still human, but they were increasingly vulnerable. Strangers became allies faster than old neighbors. Former equals became dependents. Former dependents became leaders. Hierarchies softened because hunger does not respect titles. Shared survival mattered more than inherited rank. This was not kindness, it was pragmatism. Communities that adapted by shrinking, merging, and reorganizing survived longer than those that tried to preserve old structures. Loyalty shifted from village to group, from land to people, from tradition to function. And here lies the deeper lesson. Community is not an idea, it is a system. When the system fails to sustain life, it must be rebuilt or it collapses. The famine forced people to understand this quickly. Emotional attachment to the old way of life had to give way to practical cooperation. Those who could not make that shift were left behind, often unintentionally, often tragically. The winter of 1315 reminds us that community is not defined by comfort, it is defined by crisis. When survival is at stake, belonging becomes fluid, identity becomes negotiable, and cooperation becomes the only currency that matters. What held people together was no longer history but necessity. Faith became storage, not comfort. Before the famine, faith was woven into daily life as reassurance. Prayer marked time. Ritual gave meaning. The church stood as a place of explanation, comfort, and moral order. When things went wrong, people believed repentance, devotion, and patience would restore balance. The winter of 1315 shattered that expectation. The rain did not stop because people prayed harder. The crops did not return because faith increased. The famine did not retreat because sermons grew longer. This was not a crisis faith could fix, and that forced a painful transformation in how belief functioned. As hunger deepened, faith stopped being primarily emotional comfort and became something far more practical. Monasteries with grain stores mattered more than churches with words. Disciplined religious communities survived not because they were more righteous, but because they were structured, organized, and prepared. Faith became storage. Monastic life emphasized rationing, long-term planning, obedience to routine, and delayed gratification. These traits normally associated with spiritual discipline suddenly became survival tools. Where chaos reigned, structure saved lives. People began to associate holiness less with miracles and more with endurance. Faith shifted from expectation to acceptance. Not God will stop this, but we will endure this. This was not a loss of belief, it was a maturation of it. Prayer did not disappear, but its purpose changed. It became a way to stabilize the mind, to preserve patience, to prevent panic from turning communities against themselves. Faith stopped promising rescue and started teaching restraint. And here is the hard lesson buried inside that shift. Belief that cannot adapt becomes fragile. Belief that disciplines becomes durable. Those who expected faith to remove suffering were crushed by disappointment. Those who allowed faith to reshape their behavior, how they ate, stored, worked, waited, survived longer. The famine revealed that belief is not most powerful when it explains hardship. It is most powerful when it teaches people how to live through it. In 1315, faith did not save people by ending hunger. It saved people by teaching them how to endure it without turning on one another. Comfort failed. Discipline endured. And that distinction changed everything. Sometimes survival means disappearing. The hardest lesson of the winter of 1315 is not about hunger, rain, or loss. It is about erasure. Some villages did not recover. They were not rebuilt. They were not renamed. They were not remembered. They simply vanished. And this disappearance was not always the result of death alone. It was often a decision slow, painful, and deeply human. As resources collapsed, people realized that keeping a village alive sometimes meant letting the village die. Land that could no longer feed its people became a liability. A fixed settlement became a trap. The very thing that once ensured survival permanence now guaranteed extinction. So people dispersed. Families split. Small groups moved quietly into forests, towns, monasteries, or other regions. Names dissolved into new communities. Lineages blurred. Identity scattered. The village, as a unit, ceased to exist, but the people lived on. This is what makes the lesson so unsettling. Survival did not always mean rebuilding stronger. It meant reducing pressure, reducing mouths, reducing demand, reducing visibility. By disappearing, people gave the land time to recover. They removed strain from broken systems. They allowed what remained to stabilize. The village did not survive, but life did. History struggles with this truth because it contradicts the stories we prefer to tell. We celebrate resilience, rebuilding, perseverance against all odds. But sometimes, perseverance becomes stubbornness, and stubbornness becomes fatal. The famine teaches us that continuity is not always survival. Sometimes survival requires fragmentation. Sometimes it requires surrendering legacy. Sometimes it requires accepting that something you love must end so that something else may continue. These villages were not failures. They were sacrifices. Their absence solved what their presence could not. And because history records presence more easily than absence, their story is told only through silence, through empty fields, missing names, and gaps in records. That silence is the lesson. The winter of 1315 forces us to confront a truth we rarely accept. Not all survival is visible, and not all wisdom leaves monuments. Sometimes the most intelligent response to collapse is not to fight it, fix it, or endure it, but to step out of its way. To disappear quietly, and let life continue elsewhere. The winter of 1315 does not leave us with comfort. It leaves us with clarity. It shows us that collapse does not always arrive as disaster. It often arrives as disappointment repeated long enough to break a system. No single moment. No clear enemy. Just the slow realization that effort no longer produces safety. The people who lived through this famine were not foolish, weak, or unprepared. They were trapped inside assumptions that had always worked until they didn't. And when those assumptions failed, survival belonged not to the strongest or the most loyal, but to those who could adapt without apology. This history forces an uncomfortable reckoning. Civilization is fragile because it is conditional. Community is fluid because it must serve survival. Faith endures only when it teaches discipline, not escape. And identity, however precious, is negotiable when life itself is at risk. Most of all, the famine teaches us that survival does not always look heroic. It often looks quiet. It looks like walking away. It looks like letting something end without closure so something else can continue. The villages that vanished were not erased by failure. They were erased by intelligence applied under impossible pressure. History rarely honors that kind of wisdom, but it survives because of it. And if there is one final lesson the winter of 1315 leaves behind, it is this. Pay attention not only to what is breaking, but to what is quietly disappearing. Because that is where the deepest truths of survival are written.